Oh my god. Oh my god, I'm so sorry.
Welcome back to another session of Captain's Counseling Corner. This is video number 5 in the series, and if you happen to just accidentally stumble upon this video or YouTube's algorithm sent you here, I'm going to put a card right here for you to go back to the first video so that you can start from the beginning, and that way you can catch up and this video makes more sense if you go through it. So if this is the first time you've been here, please go back to the first video in the card and then catch up so this video makes more sense to you. So as a recap or a summary of what we talked about in the last video, we basically went from talking about the setup or the definition in terms, the misconceptions, to finally getting into the meat of how do we establish these kinds of friendships. And what we did is we started with the first of the 3 in the triship. And as I said, and I want to make very, very clear, the first of the 3 in the triship, as I want to review, is the most important of the 3. You cannot have the other 2 unless you first have established the first triship, which is proximity. So proximity is about basically spending time together in each other's presence. So the main point about proximity that we all have to understand is that when you communicate or when you're getting to know somebody, it is really important to spend actual face-to-face time with them, because if you're talking on the phone, if you're text messaging them, if you are just seeing them once in a while, you are missing the most important part of communication, and that is the nonverbals. By spending not only a couple of minutes with someone, but by spending hours, minutes, weeks, years together, all those nonverbals that are going on without you saying anything is going to let you know exactly who that person is without them being able to necessarily manipulate you. Because at the beginning, it's certainly possible, and I think most people do this without knowing it at all, most people, is we put on our best face, we put our best foot forward when we're trying to meet somebody for the first time. Most people. Now there are some crazy people that don't give a shit, but for the most part, you try to present yourself in the best way possible. That's pretty easy to do with people that you don't really hang out with that much, because you can put on an act for a couple of minutes, maybe a couple hours, and you can do that every once in a while when you meet your friends or other acquaintances. But when you're around somebody hour after hour, day after day, roommates, taking long trips, these really get to show you who your friends are, because after a couple hours and days and maybe a few weeks, the real person starts to come out. This is the essential quality about proximity, is it sets up the other 2, which we're going to talk about today and in the next video, because when you have proximity, it allows the other 2 to actually become apparent or real. Without proximity, it's just like Facebook friends. Everyone bitches and complains about Facebook friends because Facebook, basically everyone's presenting the best side of who they are. Rarely do you see someone posting bad things about their life. They complain, but they mostly set up good memories or stuff like that. You don't really ever see the tragedy or the difficulty in someone's life through Facebook. And the same thing, this is what's crazy, is the same thing happens with acquaintances. When you only see each other once in a while, it's easy to hide. It's easy to get away with not really showing who you really are. And that is basically the second step that we are going to talk about today in the triship.
You feel like you're alone, Will?
What?
Do you have a soulmate?
Do I have to define that?
Once you consistently have proximity in a relationship, this is kind of the gateway or the door that opens up a relationship to get into the deeper realm of what I would call simple friendship. However, if you just have proximity and you have nothing else, well, then you're definitely not going to go into the deeper waters. And we have seen in different situations where you can have a lot of time with other people, let's say at work or even your family. A lot of times blood families fall into this category where even though you're around each other all the time, if I'm in one room and you're in the other room, even though we're in proximity to each other, if we are not talking and we are not really pushing each other to get deeper, then we're not going to have a friendship just because we are around each other. So on our journey down the tri-ship, the first one that we have is proximity. But the second one, if you haven't figured it out by now, is the V. And what is the V? The V is vulnerability. Vulnerability, in my opinion, out of the three, is actually the most difficult of the three. Proximity is the one that establishes the other two and is foundational, and you can't have the other two unless you have proximity. But proximity really isn't that hard to establish. You just have to make time and be around each other. Vulnerability is something that is particularly difficult whether you're a man or a woman, but it's specifically something that eludes men.
I guess I'm just a pussy, huh? Yeah.
And there's some reasons why, I think, and we'll talk about this later. But even women, though the stereotype about women is that they are more emotionally deep and they can connect to their emotions, they have a different difficulty and a different set of barriers when it comes to women connecting on a deeper, more vulnerable level. So when we talk about vulnerability, vulnerability is basically establishing what we talked about in video number 2. And that was the difference between first level questions and second level questions. So when we talk about first level questions, as a quick recap, remember first level questions is when you basically just ask the questions that always have answers to them. Or when it comes to relationship, basically just talking about the things that are on the surface. So you talk about sports, you talk about shopping, you talk about the argument you had with your boyfriend, but it doesn't really go into the deeper part or the deeper waters that really establish the motivations, the trauma, the pain, the deep, dark things, the sadness, the possible depression, the real roots of why we do the actions that we do or why we say the things that we say on the surface level. The only way to get to these deeper roots, the only way to get to this vulnerability is, number one, you got to have proximity. So you're around each other where you can start to see where those motivations may come from. But that's not enough. That is why we have a tri-ship. That is why we have to move past just being around each other, just like you saw in the Office clips. If you don't ever say anything and you don't ever go into those deeper waters, you're not going to establish a deep connection. So this deep connection or this deep vulnerability is particularly difficult for men to do. I would say in my lifetime, there have been maybe a handful of occasions that I can really remember. And I tend to think of myself as more of a vulnerable kind of guy than maybe a lot of the typical males, where you cry or you show your deep side or emotional side as a male. But again, this is not the only thing. Just because you cry doesn't mean you're being vulnerable. It's really getting to the root of why you cry. When you get angry, that's an emotion. Just because you get angry or you show emotion is not necessarily vulnerable. It's a key or a window to being vulnerable. So what exactly is being vulnerable?
This desk set wants to fly. Todd? The world's first unmanned flying desk set.
Basically, to be vulnerable means that you are allowing yourself the possibility to be hurt by others. Now, this is a key factor in understanding the basic idea of vulnerability. Now, we all, across the whole world, have what's called self-defense mechanisms. When you were very little, when I was very little, whenever we were hurt emotionally or even physically, our body reacted a certain way. This is called the fight or flight response. The problem is when we were young, we didn't have the ability to rationally think through a process and to decide what was the appropriate and best way to respond to the situation. We just reacted. And then over time, this established what we call styles of relating. And these styles of relating are basically just there to stop us from getting completely annihilated or hurt. It's just like physical pain. Most people, when they feel physical pain, the very first thing they do is try to alleviate that physical pain. You just don't deal with it. You try to alleviate it. So if you have a headache, most people will try to take a medicine, take a pill. If you cut yourself, you put on a Band-Aid. These are simple ideas of how you alleviate pain. The same thing happens emotionally, but this is more subconscious and unconscious. So we establish these styles of relating, but what we don't realize is that over time, we protect ourselves so much that we never allow anyone to enter. So what's interesting about this fact is, again, this is just stereotypically, doesn't mean there aren't exceptions to this rule. But when it comes to women, women tend to avoid vulnerability through venting and complaining. Men tend to withhold vulnerability through withdrawal and ignoring. So these are two different styles. Now again, there are exceptions to this rule, but this is a generally kind of established way that men and women differ in how we stop being vulnerable with each other. So to start with, you actually need to be vulnerable with yourself in a way by asking these deeper, more interesting second level questions that we talked about in the previous video and I reminded you earlier in this video. So when we get to what's called self-awareness, the only way you can become self-aware is to be asking yourself on a consistent basis through your life, why did I just do that? What's my motivations for doing that? Where can I go the next time I do that instead of how I did it this time? When you ask these vulnerable questions or you challenge yourself to think deeper to the unconscious motivations and reasons why you do things, this will help you to become self-aware. But hold up. This is the problem. We can only take ourselves so far. And this is where it is a requirement and why relationships are so essential to our lives and to the deep connecting reason of life. And that is because you can only go so far with yourself. What you actually need to do is you need to have other people who are also self-aware and open to being vulnerable because they've been first vulnerable with themselves, which is a little bit easier because you're typically not going to hurt yourself. But when you have someone who is self-aware and has asked themselves the questions, they can also reflect to you some of the ways that you are doing things that perhaps you have not seen before.
Isn't there an easier way? No.
A man who has not been surrounded in deep relationship, by definition, cannot be self-aware. In order to be self-aware, you must have other people reflect to you who you actually are by seeing the way that you do things through proximity and then going to the second level questions of challenging and trying to get to the motivations and the subconscious and unconscious reasons for why you do that. But I want to say this because this is very, very interesting what men can do in this situation. I have been a part of several philosophy clubs. And philosophy is a great way, the second level questions of asking deeper things. But just because men, because I can hear already some of you men that are listening to this saying, yeah, I think deeply, I ask some deep questions. There is a difference between asking deeply and facing deeply.
Hates me. My dad hates me. He hates me so good.
So it's very, very interesting that just because you can ask second level questions doesn't necessarily mean that you're being vulnerable again. Being vulnerable is when you are actually being exposed. So to be exposed, you need to be asking yourself questions, number one. Number two, you need to be surrounded by other people who ask themselves questions and therefore can ask you questions. And when they challenge you and you are not just having this discourse with yourself in your mind, but you have somebody challenging the ways that you think or the things that you do, you start to begin to see how you have guarded yourself so tightly, and I have guarded myself so tightly, that I don't allow anybody in to have these deep and vulnerable relationships. So what I usually have is just these acquaintances who never challenge me. We have fun, but I never get to the deeper side of who I am.
You feel like you're alone, Will? Somebody who challenges you. I'm talking about someone who opens up things for you, touches your soul.
I got plenty.
Well, name them.
Shakespeare, Nietzsche, Frost, O'Connor, Kant, Pope, Locke.
That's great. They're all dead. You don't have a lot of dialogue with them. You'll never have that kind of relationship in a world where you're always afraid to take the first step because all you see is every negative thing 10 miles down the road.
Vulnerability is a tough one because it's something that you have to continually, throughout your life, make a decision to go against what's natural. Especially for men, this is such a difficulty because we like to withhold in order to protect, especially with other men, because we grew up, or at least I grew up, in a culture where if you touch another man or you express emotions to another man, well, then you're gay. And this has maybe gotten a little bit better, but I think there's something essential about masculinity that this hump is very difficult, no pun intended, to get over when it comes to being able to share and connect deeply and be vulnerable with another man. So this is something that you have to continually make a decision in your life to go there with your friends because it's risky and because it's hard to do. A lot of people feel like, especially men, feel like they can't talk to their friends or their acquaintances in this manner because it feels uncomfortable, because it feels risky.
I can't talk to him this way.
And you're acting for him, too.
So a little quick side note about vulnerability is it's very easy with vulnerability to only think of the negative side, where you share the things that have hurt you in the past, where you get to know the darker side of who you are. But the other side is just as important in vulnerability. To share with your friend how much you care about them. To tell them, man, you really bring me joy in my life, and I hope that our relationship can continue to grow stronger, and I love you, man.
I love you, man. Yeah, and I love you too, Terry. No, I mean it, man. I love you.
I really appreciate our relationship. Let's continue forward to push each other. Sharing those joys are just as vulnerable as sharing the negative, sad, traumatic events of life. Because when you share with them how you feel about them, remember, vulnerability is about exposing yourself to possibly being hurt. Well, when you tell someone, I really care about you, I really want to let you know how much I love you, this could come back to hurt you. They could reject you. They could use it in the future to harm you. So both sides of the coin of vulnerability, the negative and the positive, are really what being vulnerable is about, so that you can develop a relationship that is close. And the point of that close relationship is to make you a better you.
What's up?
Autos, okay, that looks like it.
Oh my goodness. You ain't getting back up there?
So you ready? Okay, there's the first one.
Thanks.
Dude, this is incredible. Two brothers hugging, man. Made me and Tim cry. Didn't it?
Aw, dude, I wept like a baby.
I know, man. And there's the ending of it. Sorry I couldn't capture the rest of it, but just saw some brotherly love that I haven't experienced in my life, and Tim hasn't experienced in his life, and just caught us off guard and made us cry. I know. With these brothers, we definitely have. And
Cracks me up when you stick that thing on yourself, man.
it's my journal,
It's
dude.
his journal. He's got to get his
I
face.
gotta do it. But it definitely has changed my life. And Jake was just telling a story about Rick and about how he loved to play basketball, and just, man, we all started weeping because it showed brotherly love. So that was the end of it. Had to capture it later. So once again, we have just scratched the surface of talking about vulnerability. There is a lot more we could discuss, and maybe we can do that in a different time or a different place. In the YouTube comments, would love to hear what you have to think or what you have to say about vulnerability in your own life, or if you feel like this is something that is possible, that you would like to strive for, or if you think this is something that is just not possible in our relationships anymore. I do think that as we get busier and busier, it's harder to have proximity, it's harder to have vulnerability. And next week, we are going to get into the third of the tri-ship. But so far in the tri-ship, we have proximity as your number one, which I've said is something that is the foundation, and it establishes the ability to have the other two. But vulnerability is probably the hardest of the three to really accomplish on a day-to-day, month-to-month, or year-to-year basis, because it's something that you constantly have to push yourself to be open, to be honest, to be risky, to be vulnerable. So, as always, like and subscribe, and we'll see you next week for the third of the tri-ship. Have a great day. Peace out.
Show me the heart unfettered by foolish dreams, and I'll show you a happy man.